Coe who is a mycologist, lives in Woodside. He will really treat us to some real good knowledge about local mushrooms and fungi. On June 24th, Tim Ramirez, who spoke to the community a few years ago about the extension of the Ridge Trail, is going to get us all updated on the fuel break project that's going on in the watershed now, and also the latest developments in the Ridge Trail extension. And it looks like a few people from Mid-Peninsula Open Space staff will also join us that night as well. So these will be announced on Google I/O and also in the next upcoming Echo. I really want to thank our presenters tonight. This will be recorded so that people who can't be here, or if you have to leave or something, you will be able to see it again. And there will be a question and answer feature also that will be explained to you. Our presenters tonight are Hannah Ormshaw, who is a Natural Resource Manager, and David Cowman, Conservation Project Manager. And I am going to turn it over to them with huge appreciation. Thank you.
Thanks, Betsy. So before I jump into the presentation, I did just want to explain how we'll run the question and answer. So we do have a chat box where you can enter questions in, and Sheena, who's on the call, will be able to answer some of those in the chat as the meeting's going on, but we can also answer them out loud. If you would prefer to have the mic, we'll also be able to turn over mic access and give you the speaker ability, but the default right now is have mics and cameras turned off. But if you'd like to have access to the mic once we get to the questions and answers, if you just want to raise your hand, I'll turn that on, and we'll be able to answer questions that way too. And so just to get into the presentation, I'll share my screen. Can everyone, David, maybe if you let me know that that's showing up properly?
Yeah, it does.
Great, thank you. So tonight we want to provide some more information to the community about the upcoming forest health and fuel reduction projects planned for Huddart and Wunderlich County Park. So as an introduction to the project, I wanted to start off by just spending a bit of time to set the stage and go over what we mean by forest health and the concept of healthy forests, and how this helps guide us in our decision making and our overall objectives for doing this type of work. And then some of these types of projects or activities are things you may already be familiar with. But the images you can see on this slide show good representations of forest conditions that we're used to seeing in the parks. So the top image, which has a mixture of trees and plenty of dense understory shrubs. And in the bottom image, you see an example of a more managed forest. That's a good representation of where some sort of management activity has occurred to reduce the understory vegetation density. And so we'll go into why we want to do this type of management work. So what we see typically in a lot of our present day forests are actually usually representative of less than ideal ecological conditions. Historically, natural disturbances like large grazing herds or low intensity fires have been a regular part of their ecosystem cycles, and these would promote regeneration and regrowth in forests. So this type of disturbance has been a good thing. But things like human intervention or pressures on open space by urban areas has reduced or eliminated this type of natural disturbance. So what we see more typically today are dense forests that have a pretty high understory overgrowth of trees and shrubs, a lot of competition for resources, so things like light or soil nutrients or water. These forest stands can be more susceptible to diseases. And we also generally consider these forests a bit more stagnant. They're at their carrying capacity, and there isn't a lot of opportunity for new diversity or new or other changes in the forest structure. So by doing this type of forest management work that we have planned, the result would be a reduced competition for resources, more opportunity for the trees that are retained or the vegetation that is retained to be able to grow and mature. It would help to trigger regeneration and regrowth in the understory species. It would create some patchiness or some heterogeneity in the forest age and the forest structure. And it would also benefit wildlife by helping to create some movement corridors and foraging habitat. In addition, certainly the understory vegetation thinning also provides a benefit from a community safety and fuel reduction point of view. You're likely familiar with the shaded fuel break approach from the Kings Mountain Road project that was done at Huddart in 2019. But the goal of this would be to reduce the understory vegetation density while retaining mature trees in the upper canopy. And these conditions would be more conducive for wildfire risk reduction. So in the event that a wildfire would occur, the shaded fuel breaks would help slow the spread of fire. It would reduce the likelihood that the fire would reach the forest canopy and get out of control. And it would also allow for better access to these areas for emergency fire response and suppression, which would further limit the spread of a wildfire. And as I mentioned, historically, fires have been this natural disturbance that has been, a regular and important part of forest ecology. So there is a distinction between what can be considered a good fire versus what could be a damaging fire. So a good fire would be one that's low intensity. It really burns up what's on the understory in terms of debris or vegetation, but it would stay out of the forest canopy. And this type of fire would promote vegetation regeneration and the just natural cycles of forest succession. So should a wildfire occur, it would be our hope that it would behave this way, and that our sort of management actions would help to promote this type of fire behavior. So what you can see in the image is a good example of that, where the fires created some charring or some burn marks on the lower portions of the trees. It's mostly just what's in the understory that burned, but you still have live canopy in the upper parts of the forest. Conversely, what we would consider a damaging fire is something that's high severity. It reaches into the upper canopy and results in much higher tree mortality. It would take a lot longer for forests to regenerate after this type of fire. And this is more representative of what we've seen in recent years with the mega fires in the state. These pictures in particular are examples from the Buteno Ridge, which is an area that burned in the recent CZU fire. So by doing understory vegetation thinning, we're reducing ladder fuels, which are things like trees, shrubs, or vines that climb up the tree trunks. And if these fuels are burning, these could create a path for fire to ignite and spread into the upper canopy, which is what we want to avoid. Other benefits of the work are that we're actively addressing infestations of invasive species in the parks, so things like broom, eucalyptus, and acacia. We're also working to reduce the effects that sudden oak death has had in these forests and within our parks. So we would be removing dead trees that have died due to sudden oak death. We'd also be removing some California bay trees, which are a vector for sudden oak death. And are primarily responsible for the ongoing spread of this pathogen in the parks. Lastly, before we start getting into some of the specifics of the project, another benefit is increased carbon storage. Forest thinning and reducing the competition for resources actually provides a benefit from a carbon storage standpoint. The retained trees would have more resources available to be able to grow larger. A good example is our redwood trees. So these are really the world champions in terms of carbon storage, which translate as above ground biomass. So a mature or old growth redwood can store nearly 3 times as much carbon as a typical second growth redwood. So while redwoods are significant for their carbon storage capacity, the same concept also holds true for other tree species. So being able to retain and promote growth for mature oak trees would also be able to increase the above ground biomass for these species as well. And so for this particular project, it's been calculated that about 3,500 metric tons of carbon will be sequestered over the lifespan of the project, which is roughly equivalent to the amount of carbon that 675 Americans produce in 1 year. So our partners for the project, we have David Kalman, who will be presenting some slides shortly, but he is with the San Mateo Resource Conservation District, who are our partners in implementing this project. The project originally was identified as a need by the county parks staff, and this is based on observed declining forest health and a lot of sudden oak death affected forests or affected trees within the forests, and also identifying the fuel risks that that were present, and that these are what risks were posed to the surrounding communities. And so we began working with the San Mateo Resource Conservation District to pursue funding opportunities for the work. And the San Mateo RCD was successful in being awarded this grant that will be funding the project. And the grant was provided through CAL FIRE and the California Climate Investments Group. And the RCD has really been taking the lead in managing the project and will be leading the efforts to oversee the work through the duration of the project. Just a little bit more about the grant itself. So the CAL FIRE program, the Forest Health Grant Program, aims to fund active restoration and forest management activities to promote forest resiliency, mitigate climate change, and protect communities from wildfire risk. Much of the funding also comes from the California Climate Investments Group, which uses cap and trade dollars to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And our project meets many of the goals of this grant program. This we like to show just as a visual as well, and for context for why CAL FIRE also considered this work very high priority for funding and very valuable to complete. And it's that we're located here sort of in the middle part of the county where Huddart and Wunderlich are. And these are considered areas that are classified by CAL FIRE as being a very high fire hazard severity zone. And this is based off of data sets that CAL FIRE maintains that consider environmental conditions like vegetation, terrain, the type of weather that can contribute to wildfires, and just the prevalence and presence of homes in these locations as well. And I also just briefly wanted to highlight this resource, which CAL FIRE has published, for those of you that might be interested in learning more about some of the different recommended or utilized treatment approaches that CAL FIRE uses, or what they recommend for doing fuel reduction work, and what the benefits of different techniques are. So I encourage you to take a look at this as a great resource for understanding more about fuel reduction. And just while we're on this slide, I want to highlight the image that's on the right-hand side, which is a masticator. And that will be one of the pieces of equipment that will be used pretty heavily for this project. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to David to just provide some more information on the project.
Yeah, so like Hannah said, my name is David Kalman, and I'm a project manager for the San Mateo Resource Conservation District, working on forest health and fire resiliency projects. I'll be going to some project details and then the timeline for the project. So the overarching goals of the project are to proactively restore forest health, protect upper watersheds, promote long-term carbon storage, like Hannah said, and minimize the potential for loss from large, intense wildfires. The project in total is going to cover about 402 acres, with 218 or so acres at Huddart County Park and about 185 acres at Wunderlich County Park. The treatment will primarily be composed of, like Hannah said, mechanical mastication on slopes averaging less than 30% to thin dense tree stands or tree cover, as well as dead, dying, or diseased tree populations. Mostly we'll be targeting trees less than 8 inches in diameter, as well as some larger trees that are currently dead or dying from diseases like sudden oak death. And work will be completed in an environmentally and culturally sensitive manner, with significant thought and consideration put into developing minimization and avoidance measures for biological and cultural resources. So as part of a forest health focus, fuel reduction and fire resiliency is a very beneficial added benefit to the project. So removing and reducing live and dead vegetative fuels will decrease fuel continuity, decrease flammability, and accelerate decomposition of plant material. Next slide, please. So these three photos show the time sequence of activities for similar work that was done on Kings Mountain Road, like Hannah explained, as part of the governor's emergency fuel reduction projects in 2019. So the first photo, the photo on the left, shows pre-treatment with dense vegetation that's tightly packed together. We'd call that vertical and horizontal fuel continuity. And it's primarily composed of manzanita and other flammable shrubs. The middle photo is immediately following treatments, which admittedly can look pretty drastic to the untrained eye. And then the third photo is 1 year post-treatment. So it's important to note that vegetation in California, like Hannah has said, has adapted to disturbance, whether that be grazing by herbivores, prescribed fire by Native Americans, wildfire, or in this case, a fire surrogate being mechanical mastication. So as a response to this disturbance, many of our native plants will transfer energy to new growth, seed production, and other means of coping with this disturbance. In essence, native species do grow back after this type of project or disturbance. Next slide, please. And there's a bit of a lag between, I think, when Hannah presses next slide versus when I see it, just so that's what this pause is. Okay, as I mentioned, we've gone through a pretty extensive environmental review for this project. We hired a local forester to prepare the environmental compliance documents. We've hired biological consultants to conduct rare plant surveys for species such as Kings Mountain manzanita and Anderson's manzanita. And we've supplemented all that knowledge with San Mateo County Parks staff biologists, arborists, as well as RCD staff biologists and environmental professionals. Additionally, we've performed wildlife surveys prior to implementation, and we will be doing them throughout implementation as well for species such as red-legged frogs, and then nesting birds, wood rats, and bat roost surveys throughout the project during the correct seasons. So all sensitive resources or nests will be flagged for avoidance before the project. And there are additional avoidance and minimization measures built into the project specifications, as well as the environmental documents, to minimize and avoid impacts to biological and cultural resources throughout the project. So we also did a pretty extensive cultural resource study into that area. And finally, throughout the project, habitat features such as downed logs, standing dead trees, habitat trees, and other pockets of kind of habitat structure will be retained. Next slide, please. So permitting for this project, the RCD and county parks are utilizing the California Vegetation Treatment Program's Programmatic Environmental Impact Report for compliance with the California Environmental Quality Act. So a project-specific analysis, or PSA, was developed for this project, which analyzes if the project is consistent with the programmatic EIR. And then it lays out avoidance and minimization measures for this specific project. All necessary environmental avoidance and minimization measures were outlined in this document and will help guide us throughout the duration of the project. Next slide, please. So this is a map of treatment areas for Huddart County Park. As you can see, most of the activity will occur towards the northwestern portion of the park. However, plots are dispersed throughout the entire park. This is kind of a good representation of our rationale for layout. As I mentioned, treatments will occur on slopes averaging 30% or less, so they tend to be congregated around ridge tops or upper slopes and kind of the flatter portions of the park. And it's also important to note that since this project has a forest health focus, there are treatment areas that are both adjacent to roads and infrastructure, like other typical fuel reduction projects, as well as farther into the forest and into the park, kind of away from roads and infrastructure. Next slide, please. So this is a map of the treatment areas in Wunderlich. Again, you can see that polygons are located adjacent to roads as well as deeper into the forest. Fuel reduction and defensible space get a lot of focus during conversations about wildfire and forest management, obviously for a good reason, because the primary goal is to protect health and safety and infrastructure. However, managing for a healthy fire and pest resilient forest is also a critical component in reducing wildfire risk. So these types of projects seek to kind of look at the problem from a large landscape scale level. Next slide, please. So finally, this is our kind of implementation timeline. Planning and permitting, we're nearing the end of the permitting process. We've produced the environmental documentation, we've done the studies, and we'll be filing the notice of determination very shortly. We've also gone through the bid process and we've chosen a primary contractor for the project. We are currently going through the contracting portion of that. So we've received bids and we've chosen our contractor, but we have not signed the contract just yet. We've completed preliminary biological and botanical surveys, and we'll be performing nesting bird surveys throughout the duration of the project, as well as wood rat and bat roost surveys. And then we're hoping to begin implementation on the project on July 1st or the beginning of July, and continuing until conditions get too wet in the winter. And then we'll perform the work kind of seasonally into 2022 as well, weather dependent, of course. So after the project is completed, San Mateo County Parks will be performing ongoing maintenance and monitoring on a quarterly basis to determine maintenance needs for the project. And because the CEQA documentation is valid for 10 years, they can continue working under this permit that we're developing and continue to maintain the good work that we're doing this year and next year. So now I'll turn it back to Hannah.
Thanks, David. So just to build on what David said about the monitoring and maintenance that we'll be conducting. So this is sort of a sequence of these monitoring activities that will be occurring prior to the project. So flagging and delineating the project areas as well as sensitive resources that are present. We've completed rare plant surveys that were timed appropriately throughout the past year to identify species while they were in bloom. We've had wildlife surveys conducted, and we'll, in the few weeks prior to implementation and in the even few days prior to implementation, we'll be doing more nesting bird and roost surveys and den surveys. And as I mentioned, doing the flagging to properly avoid these sensitive resources. We'll also be monitoring the project throughout the duration to make sure the work is being done as planned and to scope. We'll be looking for if or when other project BMPs, so best management practices or avoidance minimization measures are needed, and we'll be continuing nest, roost, or den surveys seasonally as needed. And then at the post-project stage, County Parks will take over ongoing monitoring for, again, the work that was performed once everything is completed, and also be monitoring for any areas where erosion could potentially be a concern. We'll be looking for regrowth of invasive species so that we can do maintenance and control efforts if there are any invasive species regrowth issues. And we will be also monitoring for other long-term maintenance so that we can continue to maintain the benefits for forest health and fuel reduction for the long term. And so we are still I guess at this point, just a couple weeks out from getting the project started. So I did want to cover what you can all expect out at Huddart and Wunderlich during the project. So we will have to implement periodic trail closures for public safety while the work is occurring in certain areas. We'll be working closely with the contractor once we have that contract finalized to be able to outline how the project will be phased. And we'll be able to share more details on anticipated trail closures once we have that planned out in a bit more detail. But our hope is that we can phase the project in ways that can limit the extent of trail closures that are needed at any given time so that we can keep parts of the park open for recreation. But the closures will be necessary and it will be variable what needs to be closed and when. So definitely we'll be posting all of this to our website as advisories when we do have to do closures. So pay close attention to that to keep up to date on trail conditions and trail closures. It will be over several months at a time where work is being carried out, so it does have a long duration. As you're probably familiar with, there is certainly a visible change in how the forest looks in the weeks after the project is completed. After, as you experienced seeing for the Kings Mountain Road project, but like with some of the pictures seen before, most of these plants are adapted for regrowth, and we do see a lot of native vegetation regeneration in the growing season that follows after this work is completed. And also there will be noise generated from the equipment that is operating the parks. We will be using work windows, so work should only be occurring during business hours for the most part on weekdays and wouldn't be planned for weekends. So there wouldn't be noise ongoing through weekends. And again, because they'll be moving throughout the park units, there will be different areas where noise is more significant than others. So with that, we'd just like to open it up for some questions and answers and be able to answer any questions you have and give more information. So again, if anyone, feel free to type questions you have in the chat or just raise your hand and I'd be happy to give you mic access and ask away any questions you might have. So I see a question from Brenda, what native plants are being protected as a priority? Certainly the rare plants that have been identified through our rare plant surveys are going to be flagged and avoided. So that includes Kings Mountain manzanita, Anderson manzanita. There was a patch of San Francisco onion and potentially a rare orchid. So those are some of the specific plant species that will definitely be avoided. However, we're also working to retain other common natives that provide habitat value. So this can include certain native shrub or tree species that we want to see retained in the forest that provide great diversity, and also could include other types of native wildflowers or other pockets of native vegetation that we just want to keep because they do provide that nice diversity and nice variability, and they don't pose much risk in terms of fuels.
And you may have mentioned this, but riparian species are just inherently protected because there will be no project activity in riparian areas. And in general, hydrophytic water-loving plants will be protected.
Yeah, that's right. So next question is, suspect species like broom will be pulled out by masticators, but will they sprout back? So just to clarify, the masticator itself won't be physically pulling up roots. So there will be roots still left intact for all of the species that are present currently. And so because of that, yes, it is likely that broom it will sprout back. We also, even if the roots were pulled, there would likely be regrowth of broom because they do have a long seed bank. So even if they were moved that way, we would probably still anticipate regrowth. But that is part of our long-term maintenance plan for the project, is to be able to look for areas where we are seeing invasive species regrowth like broom, and be able to do follow-up work to continue to treat those and remove those species. And hopefully over time, that amount of control will reduce those populations. What about the oaks that succumbed to sudden oak death after the initial clearing? So unfortunately, sudden oak death is a major issue, and it won't be possible to really eradicate sudden oak death from the forest through this project. And so spread will continue there. And the fact that we are leaving trees that have a greater diameter, some of those oak trees may already be showing symptoms of sudden oak death and showing signs of decline. Our hope with addressing sudden oak death is that we can remove the trees that have already been killed by sudden oak death, or reduce the vectors throughout the forest stand that could continue to spread it throughout the park and into other areas that we aren't seeing as much impact from sudden oak death. But it is going to be an ongoing issue. We won't be able to eradicate sudden oak death completely, but our hopes is that the efforts can help reduce the spread and help to remove some of those trees that have died because of sudden oak death. How comparable is mechanical reduction versus controlled fire approaches? For mechanical, is the brush left in place or piled? If not, what is the cost or benefit of removal versus broader? I'm not sure what the end for that is, but I think I get the gist. I don't know, David, if you want to.
Yeah, that's a question near and dear to my heart.
Yeah.
So for kind of larger fuel reduction and forest health projects, there's 3 or 4 major ways that you can address these types of projects. So mechanical mastication is one, prescribed fire is one, hand work is another, and then there's also grazing animals. But at the pace and scale that we currently require these types of projects in this area, the only 2 kind of alternatives that work at the pace and scale are mechanical mastication and prescribed fire. And unfortunately, the infrastructure to implement prescribed fire at the scale that we require is it's lacking at this point. So there's not a lot of fire trained personnel who are well versed in how to implement prescribed fire throughout the state. And there's also very small weather windows that are required for prescribed fire. So you need a certain level of relative humidity, a certain wind dispersal, or a certain wind speed. Smoke dispersal also plays into account. So people are trying to implement prescribed fire throughout the Santa Cruz Mountains, but there's a lot of different restrictions and hoops you have to jump through, and safety concerns and things like that. So in a perfect world, the best wildfire surrogate would be prescribed fire, but unfortunately the infrastructure is not in place. So mechanical mastication is our next best option to achieve the goals, like I said, at the pace and scale that we want.
Yeah, and for the mastication too, the material is chipped and left on site, but usually it's chipped to such small pieces that it increases the rate at which it would decompose, and it just decreases the overall volume and space of that material as well. So it poses less of a fuel risk when it's chipped and left on site in that way.
Yeah, and the term fuel reduction is often a misnomer, because in reality what you're doing is fuel manipulation. You're changing the fuel into a manner where it's less flammable and provides less fuel continuity on a vertical and horizontal plane. So we're not removing the fuel, we're just making it less flammable and hoping that it decomposes faster.
So are there any plans for reduction in the steeper areas and canyons which have high fuel loads and higher paths of, for rapid fire progression? So the approach for this project really does focus on these areas that have a slope averaging around 30%. And a large reasoning for that is just the limitations for the type of equipment that will be used. The masticators aren't able to operate on some of these deeper slopes, and our aim is to optimize being able to do the work on a larger scale over a greater acreage in the most cost-effective method, and the most cost-effective approach, which really is utilizing these masticators. Another thing to note is, many of these canyons, especially, once you reach the bottom, are these riparian areas and these creek corridors, and throughout the park, many of them are perennial, so have the added benefit of water year-round to help reduce the likelihood of really high-intensity fires happening in these deep parts of the canyon. But it would definitely be an effort that would need much more specialized equipment, much more manual effort to be able to get into some of these steep areas to do fuel reduction. And so at this time haven't been targeted, but would essentially need to be planned for with much more extensive funding as well to be able to utilize that type of equipment or focus on doing like manual handwork to do that type of removal as well. Do we expect road closures on Bear Gulch Road or elsewhere? I don't anticipate that there will be any road closures needed for Bear Gulch or for Kings Mountain Road in the same way that we had for the Kings Mountain Road project, since mostly, there will be some equipment moving in on these roadways. I don't know that having the contractor mobilizing and bringing equipment in would require extensive closures of these roadways, but perhaps David can clarify any of that as well.
That will kind of be determined with the contractor during implementation. So we don't know at this point.
Does it help with future fires if you cut up the larger oaks after taking them down? Other than sort of dead standing or hazard trees, a lot of the really large oak trees will be retained for the project. So we'll be keeping these larger mature oak trees standing unless, it's a dead tree or poses a safety hazard. Maybe I'll let David speak to the approach to sort of managing.
Yeah, so in kind of the wildland fire world, they break down different fuels into different sizes, and smaller fuels help the fire with ignition and rate of spread, and then larger fuels add some heat and residence time to the fire. So from like a fire risk scenario, larger trees, larger oaks, like bigger logs do not pose as much of a risk. That being said, if there's a huge accumulation of them, then it can increase the heat of the fire and the residence time of the fire. But for the most part, large logs left on the forest floor are not too bad for fires, and they're great for the forest ecosystem. And then any smaller limbs or branches would be masticated.
When you talk about treatment, are you talking about chemical treatment? And if so, are you aware of wells and creeks that may be impacted by runoff? So Generally, we use treatment as a broad term. It can mean manual treatment, so using just hand tools or hand crews. It can mean mechanical treatment. But yes, it could mean chemical treatment as well. And because we do have concerns for invasive species and invasive species regrowth after the project, there will be the need to do some herbicide treatment because that's often the most effective way to achieve long-term control for some of these invasive species. Our approach to doing herbicide treatment is very targeted. We're only ever applying directly to the target invasive species. We're never doing broadcast spraying, and we're always using the lowest volume of herbicide needed for effective control. And we also have specifications for which herbicide we use for treatments that would be in proximity to a water body. So there are certain formulations that are considered aquatic safe herbicides. And if it is an instance where it needs to be used in proximity to a waterway, that would be what would be used. However, because of the way the project is designed, we're largely staying out of riparian areas. And so we wouldn't anticipate needing to do herbicide work within a creek corridor. Any thoughts on using goats or cattle with fuel reduction? So we have definitely considered the use of goats or other grazing animals as a tool. We haven't implemented at this point in time, and there are definitely other costs in management related implications, or just, logistically can be difficult with using grazers as a tool. It's definitely not something we've rolled out, but have not yet been really implementing on a large scale for these types of projects. Given the severe risk of fire, what would be your top suggestions to make the effort more cost-effective, faster, and at scale? Grants seem a great start, but are usually not the ideal mechanism at scale. So I think, for this project in particular, I think it's a great example of a time in which we've been able to do work really at a landscape scale. Throughout the 2 park properties, where we are able to treat this 400-acre area, which is much larger in scale than anything we've been able to accomplish before in terms of fuel reduction, and wouldn't have been possible without this grant opportunity. That being said, there is certainly, a lot of fuel reduction needs, and funding is, important consideration for being able to complete these projects. But I think that where we're at with the funding we were able to get through this grant, we're able to accomplish a really pretty significant and landscape scale effort for doing fuel reduction. I don't see any other open questions or any raised hands, I don't think, unless I'm just looking at the wrong part. Is there any other questions? Herbicidal drift is an issue if you live across from Wunderlich. We'll be posting when you'll be doing this and with what. So yes, so with our herbicide application as well, we're also very particular about under what conditions the herbicide work is being done. So on any days when there is rainfall in the forecast, or if there has been rainfall in the past 24 hours, we don't do herbicide application because we don't want any drift through water or any seepage that way. We also never apply if the wind speeds are too high, so there's no airborne drift occurring. And we also post herbicide notices when we are applying within a certain proximity of trails or homes, so that we do provide notice. We just like to close areas while the actual herbicide application is taking place. And then once the the work is completed and the herbicides dried, it's totally safe to re-enter those areas. And so then we reopen, but we do post notices when we do that work. The map was difficult to see how close to Skyline and Kings Mountain Road are the remediation efforts. I can see if I can pull the map up again, but we also do have them posted on the County Parks website. If you want to go to the Huddart and Wunderlich Park web pages, and you'll find project pages for these two projects, and you can find locations of the map if you want to see where the work areas are in close proximity to your neighborhoods or to your homes, and get a better idea. But I'll see if I can just quickly pull those slides up again. I just need to scroll back to where they are. I'm going to share my screen again. So this is for Huddart. If you can see my cursor, Bear Gulch Road more or less follows the majority of this. Bear Gulch Road is beside Wunderlich. So Kings Mountain Road comes through here. You can see there's some treatment areas along the top corner and top edge near Skyline. And then for Wunderlich, this would be the Bear Gulch Road. Sorry for that mix up. That follows this whole upper border here. And so these purple hatch lines are the treatment areas. So you can see there's several areas where work would be occurring along this corridor. And then we also have work area along this upper portion near 35 and Woodside Road. But yeah, there are copies of the map posted to our website if you want to find copies of that just to take a closer look. Curious as the cost percentages impact studies and planning versus actual treatment.
I can answer that kind of broadly. A vast majority of the grant funding is going towards project implementation. I believe it's about 2/3 or more is going towards the implementation itself, and then the rest goes towards the impact studies and our own administrative time and project management and things like that. But almost the majority of it goes towards implementation.
I'm not seeing any other questions. Let's see one. Oh, that's just a thank you. You're welcome. I was just going to say, I want to say thank you for letting us join you tonight and give a presentation on these projects. We're really glad to be able to do this work and see the benefits that the project will provide. And we appreciate having this opportunity to provide more information to you all, and being the neighbors to our park. Happy to be able to have an opportunity to answer more questions. As I mentioned, please stay tuned for more information that we'll be posting to the website regarding trail closures, and look, especially for any of you that do live in close proximity to the park, we'll also be sending out some other more direct notices once we get closer to the start of the work as well. Yeah, thank you all. And I'll work with Betsy to also provide the recording of this video so that it can be shared if anyone wasn't able to attend. And definitely feel free to reach out to the department if you do have questions in the future. Yeah, we're here to answer more questions if anything comes up.
Yeah, and feel free to reach out to me at the RCD as well. Thank you all for letting us speak.
Well, thank you all. I'm going to end the webinar. Hope you all have a great night.